Welcome to this hazardous materials decontamination preparedness and self-assessment video. I'm John Wallace. During this program, we will address the common problems that occur when a patient presents himself to medical care professionals when contaminated by chemicals. This program focuses on the issues that most relate to your safety and effectiveness during these incidents. This program was produced and developed by the Fresno City Fire Department and financially supported by the State of California Office of Emergency Services. It's a video-based assessment program, and during the video, you will be instructed to complete exercises with the scenarios to help you determine your personal readiness, as well as the organization you work for. Now, there are three primary goals in managing a patient who has been contaminated by a hazardous material and has not undergone adequate decontamination before arrival at the hospital. Isolation of the chemical contamination. Appropriately decontaminate and treat the patient or patients while protecting hospital staff, emergency responders, other patients, and visitors. Reestablish normal service as quickly as possible. All of these goals should be accomplished concurrently. Instinct and training encourage immediate action when emergencies present themselves. Pre-planning and preparedness are essential in hazardous materials incidents. In this scenario, you'll see emergency response personnel dealing with a typical medical aid. Now look for clues that alert you to the hazards on scene.
Engine 3, Medic 31, medical aid. 3864 Fresno Street for a burn victim. Be advised the burns may have been caused by a drug lab explosion.
Are there any chemicals in the building?
No, I was out in the garage working in the shop, man. There's no chemicals. Just help me. I burned myself.
Were you working out there by yourself?
Yeah, man.
Okay. Why don't you isolate the area, see if you can find any other victims or any hazardous materials around?
Yeah, help me.
Stop the video now and complete the video exercise number 1. When you're done, return to the video.
Welcome back. Did you notice obvious clues that were presented in that scenario? In this case, the dispatch information gave you a heads up. The victim with burns, evasiveness of the victim, the explosion occurred in the garage. All of these signs confirmed a high possibility that a drug lab was on site. When dealing with hazardous materials incidents, if the emergency responders keep in mind that safety is first, isolating the incident and notifying the other responding units is a good method for setting the stage for the entire incident. If you suspect a patient is contaminated, he must be decontaminated before transport can occur. Medical care, such as stabilization of a traumatized victim of a motor vehicle accident, should not be delayed because of contamination with relatively low toxicity substances, such as diesel fuel. At the same time, a patient who is critically ill or in cardiac arrest, assumed to be caused by chemical exposure, demands caregiver protection before treatment intervention if a risk of secondary contamination remains. Now, in such an instance, basic life support may be provided during decontamination if personal protective equipment allows, and followed up immediately thereafter with advanced life support. Most emergency healthcare workers naturally concentrate on getting help to the victim without sufficient thought to their own safety. Now let's take another look at the scenario again.
Engine 3, Medic 31, medical aid. 3864 Fresno Street for a burn victim. Be advised the burns may have been caused by a drug lab explosion.
Were there any chemicals in the building?
No, I was out in the garage working in the shop, man. There's no chemicals. Just help me. I burned myself.
Were you working out there by yourself?
Yeah, man.
Okay. Why don't you isolate the area, see if you can find any other victims or any hazardous materials around?
Yeah, help me out.
Communications, medical 31, upgrade this to a hazmat incident and advise all incoming units, please. Sir.
Medic 31, I copy.
When emergency decontamination is conducted, the following issues should be taken into account. The unprotected rescuer remains far enough from the victim so as not to expose themselves to inhalation hazards from liquid vapors or solid dust particles. Each victim encountered should be evaluated by the rescuer.
Sir, why don't we get you over here and see if we can get you cleaned up and take care of your burns. What I need you to do is take off all your clothes, and we'll hose you down. What we're going to do is start from the head, and we're going to hose you down from head to toe, okay? And get all these chemicals off you so we can treat your burns.
When dealing with a victim contaminated by unknown chemicals or a known chemical with hazard properties, avoid contact unless wearing appropriate personal protective equipment, which includes self-contained breathing apparatus. When possible, the victim's clothing should be removed without causing further harm by ingestion or inhalation. When a protected rescuer assists a victim removing their clothes, cut the shirt in the back, allowing it to fall forward away from the victim. After the clothing is off, separate the victim from the contaminated clothing. Copious amounts of water over a 15-minute period is normally the most effective way for removing hazardous materials from the skin. If the material is oily, a mild dishwashing soap and soft sponge will increase the effectiveness of the decontamination process. The delay of patient treatment should not be extended beyond the amount of time it takes for a first responder to remove the victim's clothing and wash with copious amounts of water. In general, the amount of contamination on a patient is much less than what would be present at the actual site of chemical contamination. It is unlikely that volatilization of chemicals from a contaminated patient would injure hospital staff. Most hazardous material exposure victims are exposed by inhalation only and are unlikely to have enough residual chemical on their skin to present a risk to hospital personnel. Simply removing clothing will substantially decrease the amount of chemical contamination and risk of secondary contamination. However, individual sensitivity to chemicals varies, and it is not unusual for chemicals with strong odors to elicit a symptomatic response in hospital staff, even at concentrations far below commonly accepted toxic levels. If the chemical is an inhalation hazard only and there is no risk of secondary contamination, decontamination is not necessary. These types of chemicals are generally limited to true gas products.
Now let's take another look at the scenario again. In the event the victim is non-ambulatory or is not complying with your instructions, it may be necessary to physically handle the contaminated patient to minimize secondary contamination to other humans, the ambulance, and the emergency department. In this next scenario, the use of personal protective equipment will be extremely important to the rescuer's health and safety as they respond to an unknown hazardous material. All emergency departments incorporated in an emergency response plan for hazardous materials incidents through their local emergency planning committees must meet the requirements set forth by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 29 Code of Federal Regulation 1910.120 Subpart Q. This covers both training and response to hazardous materials because it's likely that you will be faced with a chemically exposed patient without previous decontamination at some time. OSHA requires level B protection when dealing with unknown chemicals, which includes a positive pressure self-contained breathing apparatus and splash protected chemical resistant clothing. However, based on the patient's condition, firefighters wearing their structural firefighting clothing along with respiratory protection are afforded limited protection and can perform emergency decontamination. Let's take a look at this type of incident.
The patient's in the van.
Okay.
The driver reports that he's been spraying some sort of a chemical in an orchard. He's having difficulty breathing and he can't get out of the van on his own.
Okay, we'll get him decontaminated. Can you get some of your staff in bloodborne pathogen PPE and a gurney prepared to receive the patient when we're done with the decon?
Not a problem.
Okay. All right, you two mask up, do an emergency decon, give him 30 pounds of pressure on that hose line there, and then see what you can do to prevent runoff from going in the storm drain.
Decontamination should never be delayed in an attempt to protect the environment. Life always comes first. If staffing allows, then make it a priority as well. 30 pounds per square inch and 30 degrees fog pattern on the nozzle is an effective technique for decontamination. Removing the clothing from the victim is an essential step in contamination reduction. Placing the clothing in a plastic container for later testing or disposal will also prevent additional secondary contamination to others. When time allows, the hot zone should be secured until environmental evaluation or restoration is completed. This will prevent entry of unauthorized personnel or bystanders, which will prevent the spread of contaminants.
Communications Engine 212. We'll need a hazardous materials response team and an environmental safety officer.
In most cases, the law enforcement agency having jurisdiction is charged with the incident command responsibility, although the fire department may have legally assumed that responsibility. It is incumbent upon you to identify which agency has incident command responsibility in your jurisdiction. The final decision to reopen the facility may officially lie with the incident commander. Thus, a close working relationship between the agency having jurisdiction and emergency department personnel and toxicology consultants is essential.
Hospitals should be prepared for the patient who is discovered sitting at the triage station contaminated. Just a few of the issues that should be addressed by all agencies and organizations are: the hospital's options for implementation of an emergency decontamination plan should include having the patients decontaminate themselves if they're capable. The establishment of a safe refuge area is to prevent additional contamination by those who may have come in contact with the victim. Secondary contamination occurs when the hazardous material is passed from the person originally contaminated to others by direct contact or contact with an object that the victim contaminated. By isolating people who may have secondary contamination stops any further spread. As soon as possible, the establishment of an isolation zone to prevent secondary contamination is also important. This could prevent the spread of the contamination from reaching other areas of the hospital. Let's take a look at this type of incident.
Hey, I don't feel good.
What seems to be the problem, sir?
Feeling sick to my stomach, kind of nauseated.
What were you doing?
I was spraying bugs and spiders kind of stuff, insect sprays.
Have you changed your clothes or taken a shower at all?
No, why?
Well, the chemicals that you may be dealing with may be causing the problem. What we're going to need to do is wash you off. Just a minute, I'll have you follow me and we'll wash you off, okay?
Okay.
Hello, security. This is triage. We have a hazardous materials decontamination we need to do. Notify valet parking we may have a contaminated vehicle. Thank you. Sir, what we're going to have you do is walk over here around this area over here and we'll wash you off over here. Just don't touch anything, stay away from people.
Triage personnel in particular should be trained to recognize high-risk situations for chemical contamination of patients. Nearly all emergency department evacuations or closures have been related to lack of early recognition and high levels of concern about the potential for secondary contamination. A predetermined location near the emergency department should be a part of your emergency plan. Treatment should not be delayed awaiting the erection of an elaborate decontamination station. The process of hazardous substance identification and the determination of the toxicity level and risk for secondary contamination may benefit from external consultation. Emergency department staff should have direct telephone access to the hazardous materials team responding to the incident so they can gather information about the incident and chemicals involved. Medical toxicologists experienced in chemical exposures may be available with local poison control centers. It is important that consultants are trained and experienced in hazardous materials exposures, or the information provided could be inappropriate or even dangerous. During your selection of a predetermined emergency decontamination site, these issues should be addressed. Is it in close proximity to locations where patients seeking emergency care may arrive? Those obvious locations are the ambulance entrance and walk-in entrance to the emergency department. Other options may include helicopter landing pads, valet parking, or the hospital's main lobby entrance. All of these areas are at risk and should be included in your emergency response plan. Where's your water source, and can you establish a pre-connected hose for emergency use? If an emergency decontamination is conducted, where is the water runoff going to collect? Can it be contained prior to entering the storm drain? If not, what would the environmental impact be? In most cases, the concentration of the chemical removed from decontamination is almost undetectable. But during your planning stages, you need to consider the worst case scenario. You should also consider the service interruption that may occur. The area you choose may be restricted for a limited amount of time during cleanup. Closing an emergency department entrance in some communities would be a major impact on services. An alternative entrance would need to be included in your pre-plan. The ideal decontamination system would be outside with appropriate ventilation and water containment. External decontamination systems should be supplied with warm running water, particularly in cold weather conditions. Portable curtains of adequate strength can provide both protection from wind and personal privacy
What I'm going to
during
have you do, instead of taking
decontamination.
your shirt off over your head and getting that stuff in your eyes and face again, I'm going to have you cut your shirt straight down. Roll it up for me. Take your watch off. Place it in the bag. Okay, take your pants off. Take them down. Your shoes as well. Place the shoes in the bag. Okay, what I want you to do is I want you to start at your head, hold your head forward, let the water run down the top of you, just like a shower. Do your head again.
The keys to effective hazardous materials management are common sense, pre-planning, and training on that plan. The equipment, training, and preparedness required for decontamination of chemically exposed patients will differ from hospital to hospital, depending on the hospital's capability to treat seriously poisoned patients and its proximity to major industrial sites, agricultural activities, and transportation routes. When a hazardous materials incident occurs in your community and the potential of walk-in victims in the emergency department is evident, your pre-plan should address a planned decontamination system. The establishment of a planned decontamination system prior to the victim's arrival will protect the environment from unwanted runoff, preventing an evacuation or a closure of the hospital, and most importantly, protecting the hospital staff from secondary contamination and providing timely patient care.
St. Agnes, this is Fire Dispatch. This is an early warning advisement. We are working a hazardous materials release at a chemical processing plant. Because the number of employees contaminated and left the scene prior to our arrival, we believe you will be receiving walk-in victims at your facility.
I copy that. We will need a first responder engine to assist us with decontamination.
Copy. We'll get one started for you.
Code green at the emergency department ambulance entrance.
Stop the video now and complete the video exercise number 2. When you're done, return to the video. When time allows, the system may be established prior to the victim's arrival. The establishment of decontamination and donning of level B chemical clothing should never cause a delay in the decontaminating of the victim. If the victim arrives prior to the planned decontamination system's readiness, an alternate emergency decontamination plan should be initiated. The reason for such a system is to provide a higher level of protection to the hospital staff and emergency responders to prevent contamination of the facility and protect the environment from contaminated runoff. Having a system in place will also reduce the cleanup time required, keeping the closure of your facility from impacting the level of emergency care to the community. Protective clothing and self-contained breathing apparatus normally worn by firefighters during structural firefighting operations provides limited protection from heat and may not provide adequate protection from the harmful vapors or liquids that are encountered during hazardous materials incidents. The risk to the responder is lowered when emergency decontamination is conducted away from the contamination source. The use of firefighting clothing for emergency decontamination should only occur when a life is at risk and time to increase the level of protection does not exist. When larger medical facilities conduct a planned or emergency decontamination once or twice a month, those facilities should consider providing the full decontamination team in-house and not dependent on the local fire organization. The benefits to having a fully staffed team in-house provides for a greater response time, and during a conflagration, the fire department may not have first responders available. The difficulty comes with the financial burden of maintaining such a team. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration requires fit testing and training annually at the first responder operations level. Also, the refilling of air bottles, maintenance, and hydrostatic testing can be logistically impractical. Your standard operating policy should include some type of incident management system. The system your facility uses should be the same system being used by your local emergency responders, such as your fire and law enforcement agencies use. This will prevent communication problems during an emergency incident. The decontamination effort will fit into the agency having jurisdiction for IC system as a decontamination unit. There will be only one person responsible for the entire team and can be called the decon leader. The leader is responsible to assure that the hazardous materials response plan has been activated, gives assignments to personnel, gives overall guidance throughout the incident, and communicates with the incident commander or hazardous materials group supervisor. The decon leader will be responsible for the following positions with the decon team. The safety officer, while assuring a safe operation is conducted, should also maintain communication with other agencies in an attempt to identify the hazardous material involved, use reference sources as needed, and initiate contact with the Poison Control Center. The triage person determines the need for decontamination and identifies the equipment requirements for the victim, such as wheelchair, backboard, or gurney. This person also assures that the best patient care is provided during decontamination. The person in charge of support personnel should have an in-depth knowledge of the equipment used in the decontamination system. This person confers with the safety officer as to the level of chemical protective clothing needed and should always be prepared to change to emergency decontamination protocols. Site control consists of controlling the scene, assuring no unnecessary personnel is wandering around inside the control zones, also controlling vehicle movement and foot traffic. The recorder is someone who documents in written form everything that occurs before, during, and after decontamination happens. This person also keeps track of multiple patients and personal belongings that are double-bagged during decontamination. Stop the video now and complete the video exercise number 3. When you're done, return to the video.
Major trauma centers and medical facilities designated by local emergency planning committees for care of chemically contaminated patients should have a higher level of preparedness. OSHA requires training as well as an emergency response plan that includes procedures for decontaminating patients and appropriate personal protective equipment for hospital staff. Accredited institutions under the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations are required to have emergency procedures that describe the specific precautions, procedures, and protective equipment used during hazardous materials and waste spills or exposures. Any plan must include contingencies for contamination sources within the hospital and for emergency department evacuation. The development of a workable hazardous materials emergency response plan requires careful thought and often professional input from medical toxicologists, hazardous materials specialists from your local fire departments, and industrial hygiene and safety officers. As we bring this video to an end, I'd like to share with you once more your primary goals in managing an exposed patient. Isolating the contamination, decontaminating and treating the patient while protecting others, and reestablishing normal hospital services as quickly as possible.